All right. Okay, so as mentioned, today's workshop series is University Prep with a focus on study skills. This will take less than an hour, but we'll leave some time for some questions. As mentioned before, this will be recorded and posted and available on the website. All right. So in talking about study skills and how to use your time more effectively and efficiently as a student, because you have many courses and a lot of information that you're trying to learn and understand, and of course, being tested on. When we look at effective study skills, the three key areas is really focusing in on understanding information rather than just straight memorization. It's more than just regurgitating information on your exam questions. But in many cases now, our professors are looking for us to be able to critically think about the information that they're sharing with us and that we're learning. So taking everything a little bit of a step further. And when we're just memorizing information, it's hard to give further thought or detail on questions that involve, more case studies or application. So if we focus on understanding rather than memorizing, it actually helps us to memorize that information more efficiently, but answer questions that involve more critical thinking or application. It's also using active learning strategies, and I'll go into examples about that, and then studying regularly. So if you have been traditionally more of a crammer when it comes to exam time, why is it important to move away from that? And why is it more beneficial to us to study more regularly and start studying earlier? So we'll talk about that today. Okay, so when we think about studying in general, I would just want us to pause for a moment and think about, how did you specifically learn how to study? Did you have a teacher, or maybe it was a friend of yours or another classmate who gave you some study tips? In many cases, no one really officially sits us down to talk about what are ways that we can study, right? It tends to look more like reviewing our notes or maybe doing some practice questions, going over our textbook is often what I see from students transitioning from high school into university. So how do we take this a step further? Also, have you ever changed your study habits over time? And what prompted you to do that? And lastly, thinking about how early or how regularly do you study? Do you tend to study the night before, or do you find 2 nights before is a good preparation amount? Or should you be considering studying earlier or more regularly? So some things to think about as we go through the presentation today. Before I get into study techniques, here are some top tips that I find can be really effective when it comes to improving your study effectiveness. The first one is reviewing your notes within 24 to 48 hours. Those of you that attended yesterday's workshop on note taking and reading, you'll remember that I mentioned this one being actually one of my favorite study tips for students overall, or study skill tips. What I love about this is that when we think about our notes, whether they are coming from our lecture or notes coming from our textbooks or our readings, it's the fact that what is the purpose of these notes other than really they are your main resource for your studying, right? So what we want to ensure is that the notes that we're taking are a good study resource tool for us. So when we take a moment to review our notes, we can help ensure that that study tool is as complete and helpful as possible. So are there any gaps in that information? Is there anything we need to include or highlight? Is there an example the professor mentioned that we want to make sure that we have thoroughly written down, or a diagram or drawing? So reviewing our notes briefly after our lecture or after we complete the reading helps to ensure that that study guide is already prepared and ready for us for when we want to begin studying. The other thing too is just that simple task of reviewing our notes is actually a mini study session, right? We're refreshing our memory about what we just learned and confirming that everything makes sense and everything is complete. At the same time, it also gives us time to fill in any gaps if we have any questions or something suddenly seems a little bit more fuzzy. Rather than increasing the panic and stress as we're studying before an exam by having to rush and fill in all these blanks, if we review our notes briefly after class, then we can ensure that if we have any questions, we now have lots of time to get those gaps filled in so that we're, again, ready to go for studying when we have that time and we wanted to dedicate our time for studying. Okay, next up, focusing on understanding before you memorize. So I already kind of mentioned this a little bit in the previous slide, but it's really important because when you already focus on understanding something, the memorization piece comes along with it. Because suddenly when we understand a definition or we understand a process, those words and those definitions, they make more sense to us. Rather than if we're trying to memorize a definition that we don't understand, those words can often feel like a jumble and it can be harder to recall that information. So rather than just memorization, focus on understanding. Do I understand what this definition means? Do I understand what this process means? If I am looking at a concept or, a theory, how can I weave this into a story or a way that I can really understand this? Once you have that in place, a lot of those other pieces will all start to connect on their own. And then finally, create a study guide for yourself. In some courses or with some professors, they may provide a study guide before a midterm or exam to help identify what are some key topics that you should really be familiar with or key definitions. So this can be really helpful. But if your professor doesn't provide that, simply going through your notes and highlighting what are key topics, terms, concepts, that can really help you to be more efficient with your studying. Now, another great tip related to that is as you're creating the study guide, take a moment to identify what you feel are going to be important concepts. And that might be identified because your professor said, this is important. Or maybe it's something that they spend half of a class on. Or maybe you found that it was in the lecture note, your professor mentioned it again, and it's also a big section of your textbook. So trying to identify information that's important because we want to use our time and attention on the important facts or the important information rather than spending an equal amount on everything. Because while we love to have all the time in the world to do our studying, the truth is, we have to think about where we are going to prioritize our time. So we want to prioritize it on concepts and information that we can identify as being more important versus information that maybe is less important. The other piece is as you're going through, it's also identifying what do you already know and feel pretty comfortable with versus what do you not know or what's more challenging or what are you still struggling to understand. The reason why this is so important is because we actually have a bit of an unconscious bias when it comes to studying. And what can often happen is that we tend to spend more of our time re-studying information we already know and understand. And part of this is just coming from, it feels good. We have positive, reinforcement of like, yes, I know this. And the information that's more challenging or difficult, we can often unconsciously avoid because it is challenging and it is difficult. We don't feel good as we're working through that, right? But the thing is, what if we really focus our time on that information we don't know? The actual return on time invested is much better because likely those challenging things will show up on the exam. And now, rather than just re-studying information you know and you feel good about, you focused your time and energy on the stuff you really didn't know. So you can see right there how that can be a lot more effective and efficient use of your time. Okay. When we look at specific study strategies, one way to look at it is thinking about how do we engage with our studying and our learning? And we can kind of generally lump it into more passive versus active type of study strategies. Passive is something where, we are letting that information more so wash over us. We're not too engaged, but we're learning by listening, maybe listening to the lecture or reading our notes, rereading our textbook, rereading our study guides, those types of things. But if we dig more into the material, we focus more on that understanding and getting more active with the material, it takes a little bit more effort, but actually, again, there is a better return on investment when we use active study strategies than passive study strategies. So when we think about active and engaging in it, we can think about, teaching each other or doing a demonstration or having a discussion with other people or doing practice exams or testing, where rather than, again, just rereading or re-listening, we're really challenging ourselves or involving ourselves with that information. So when it comes to your study techniques in university, what I encourage is that you review how you've been studying and thinking about how can I integrate more active learning strategies into my study techniques. So what are some specific examples? One of the favorite ones that I consistently hear from high achieving students is the process of condensing your notes or revising your notes or summarizing your notes in your own words. Really, this is kind of a way of creating your own study guide as well. So taking all of your lecture notes from one day, you may have one full page or you might have multiple pages of notes, and really thinking about during that lecture today, what was most important and what do I really need to focus on, focus my learning on, and condensing your notes to just that information. You're really narrowing down your focus on what you don't know and what is important. As you're summarizing it or summarizing this information, it's challenging to summarize without understanding first. So you can see how it's moving from memorization into summarization. And as soon as we're summarizing information, we're thinking about it. We're being really active about our learning. So this is a great technique to get really involved with your learning, summarizing your notes, and really focusing your energy and effort on that critical or important information that you need for the exam time. Now, I will mention that in this presentation, you'll see these slides where these pictures, they're very aesthetic notes, whether it's flashcards or summarized notes. Please know that yours don't have to look this pretty or color coded. While this looks good, remember what it really needs to be is just functional for you. So if yours looks different, that's totally fine. These are just samples to kind of give you some ideas of what you might want to try out this fall. One thing I did really like in the one image is that as they summarized their notes, they used pink and blue Post-it notes to write their notes. And I love this because they can move them around or see if they can find different links within their notes. Or if you're really studying and you find there's, one of the Post-it notes you're really struggling with and it's just, it's not sticking with your memory, you could take it out and you could put it in some place that you could review more consistently. So maybe it's taking that important Post-it note and putting it at the back of your phone. And every time you pull out your phone, you do a quick review of that little Post-it note. Or maybe you put it on the dash of your car, or maybe it's in your bathroom mirror, right? So lots of great flexibility to help you study and memorize that information. That's really important for your course. Okay. Another active learning strategy is just those good old flashcards. And they can be in the paper format, or there's a lot of great digital formats as well. So Anki is one that I mentioned before, where I had a student, and that's really how he condensed his notes. So after each class, he would take his class notes and just put them all into flashcards. He used Anki, but there's also Steady Blue, Quizlet, lots of different formats out there. And if you think about it, it really is kind of a note summarization, but now it's in a quiz form and you can study these often and it's really easy and accessible, especially if it's in the electronic format. A great tip about this is ensuring that you make these as you go along so that you're studying a little bit at a time, throughout the semester and not waiting till the week before your exam and using important study time on just creating these. Instead, you want the week before your exam to already have these created. And now you're just putting in that extra time reviewing these flashcards and the information that, is important or that you really need to focus in on. Another tip as mentioned here is as you're going through it, say your answers out loud and say those questions out loud. Oftentimes we think about it in our mind, and as we're thinking about it, we kind of jump ahead to a conclusion, or maybe we don't always get the answer completely right, but when we're saying it in our mind, we can often be like, oh yeah, I was close. Where if we say the answers out loud, we get really clear, auditory feedback to say, did I actually get the full answer correct? Could I explain it fully out loud? And if you can't, then, okay, I got to work on this flashcard a little bit more. Or if you can say it really clearly out loud, then you know, I've got this flashcard figured out, check mark, right? Okay, another great active learning strategy is to use visual aids for ourselves. So yesterday in talking about note taking, I did mention that, we can use visual aids or diagrams or charts, these types of things as a form of note taking, but they're also great study guides for ourselves. So for example, here, there's that mind map again. This is one I created on a presentation series I made on online learning. But what if you used it as a study tool in the way that number one, you condensed all your notes into one large format like this, right? You can see different connections between the different lecture days or different chapter topics, but also you can cover up different sections and kind of quiz yourself. Can I remember everything under this section? What can I recall? Or you could even take a blank piece of paper and see if you could create sort of a mind map about a chapter. So as you take that blank piece of paper, how much information can you recall or do you understand enough that you can write down on that piece of paper? Then you can take a look at that and compare it to your notes. Everything that you had written down on that blank piece of paper that you could recall, now you know, okay, I understand this enough. I don't need to focus more time and effort on it. But the information on this piece of paper that I couldn't recall, that is a really good indicator to me. Those are the areas of this course that I really need to focus my time on. So really being effective and efficient, okay? Creating charts for ourselves or a listing of different rules or formulas can be really helpful to help us organize and understand information. So a good example of this might be maybe you're in a statistics course. There's a lot of different formulas or rules or t-charts or variables that are important to keep in mind so that you can understand how to answer question A versus how to answer question B. So creating just a chart for yourself about what are the different formulas and when do you use them, or what are the different rules and what's important about each of those rules can be a really great guiding document for you as you go through and work through practice questions, right? So we can do condensed study notes for any type of class, whether it is a math class or a history class or a science class, right? The information you're condensing or how you outline them might be a little bit different based on the information, but we can really use this to our advantage. I also note in here drawing diagrams. Many of us are very visual people, and we can't rely on visual 100% all the time, but where we can add a diagram is wonderful, color coding and labeling, because it really aids us when it comes to recall on that information. You can either draw a diagram and study it and cover up different sections, or again, you can use that blank piece of paper and see if you can draw that process, or maybe that you're in an anatomy class and see if you can draw out all the bones in the arm or whatever that is. See if you can do that from memory or whatnot. Those are great active learning strategies. Okay. Some additional active learning strategies is just doing whatever practice questions might be available. So possibly in the back of your textbook, at the end of each chapter, there might be practice questions. Maybe your professor has additional practice questions on the Moodle course page, or if you'd like additional practice questions, you could reach out to your professor and see if they have maybe any old exams or quizzes that you might be able to use to prepare. The goal when it comes to doing these practice questions is to see really pre-test your knowledge. One of the things I love about active learning strategies is that because it's more involved, so, a flashcard or doing a practice question or condensing your notes, you're really challenging your brain to think about information and seeing if you understand it and if you can recall it. Those are the exact skills that you need when you go into an exam. So by using these active learning strategies, they're sort of a pre-test for you to help you identify what you really know versus what you don't know before you even get into the exam. because you really don't want the first time you're testing yourself on this information to be in the exam. Okay, so another great way to actively learn information is to teach other people. So this could be a classmate, or if you have a study group, it can even just be your roommate, or just calling a family member and saying, hey, I'm really working through this concept. I just want to see if I can explain it to you out loud. I love this because if you can explain it out loud clearly, kind of like I mentioned with the flashcards, then you know you really understand that information. And if you find partway through, I knew the first part, but not the second part, right away, again, you know what you know and where you need to further study on that information. So honing in on how you can use your study time most effectively and efficiently. Another great active learning strategy is to create a list, an acronym, or a song. What you're really doing here is trying to make that information memorable so that it's better for you when you're trying to recall it in the exam. Now, I would encourage that you're not making an acronym or a song for everything, but try and do it when you've got information that you've been trying to understand and trying to memorize, and it's not quite coming together. So that's where using a song or doing something to make it more memorable can be really helpful and help it stick out for you when you're in the exam. If there's a way to model or demonstrate information where you're actually physically actively involved in your learning, that's great too. So maybe you're in a chemistry class and you're looking at the different connections, or the chemical makeup of something, and you might have an actual physical chemistry set that you can work on building those things together. That would be great. Or if you're, again, in an anatomy class and you're trying to memorize the different bone structures, can you stand up and point out those different bone structures on your own body and say them out loud? Also, you can self-test by even seeing if you can predict what would be a test question and what would be the answer to it. Trying to self-test or come up with these things, you might find that you can predict a lot of those test questions, so you're better prepared for it, and also just further your learning and understanding. As mentioned, creating a study group can be a really great active learning strategy or technique. It also provides a nice support group for you in courses, because for many of you, especially if you're in your first year, you might find, these classes are large and you might not know many people, but as you continue forward within your program area, your classes will become smaller and you'll get to know or recognize more students within your class. So creating a study group earlier rather than later on can really be beneficial as you get to those smaller classes, and as some of those courses can become more challenging, then you already have a support community with you. So in creating a study group, first it's finding participants. That could be as simple as, in your class, looking to the left and looking to the right and seeing if anyone would like to form a study group, or even your class Moodle pages. Often there is a class email list or discussion board, and you can throw it out there too to see if anyone's interested in forming a study group. And in creating one, here's some quick tips. First, deciding where you're going to meet, whether it's in person and where, or is it going to be a virtual study group? How often do you want to meet? And what kind of expectations are each of you expecting within the study group? The more that you work together and use this time effectively, the more you'll get out of it. So some ways that you can use your time well is, maybe doing a note review. What was the lecture about? What do we think are key topics? Was there anything anyone didn't clearly understand that we can help each other learn? Maybe as a group, you can form flashcards together. So one person takes this part of the lecture, another person takes this part of the lecture. It really saves you a lot of time and effort, and then you have one collective group of flashcards. You could even teach each other or create a study guide together. So there's a lot of great ways that you can use the study group. It's also really helpful if, maybe one day you miss a class because you're sick. Now you've got a great resource to help fill you in on the class that you missed, and all of those other supports as well. Not to mention, it's a great way to just meet some classmates and build a community. Okay, so we've talked about how to study effectively in using active learning strategies, really focusing in on understanding rather than memorizing, really using strategies that make us think about the material and kind of, mini tests and mini quizzes for ourselves. The other part of it that's really important is to study regularly. So studying often, studying earlier than you think. But the other piece too is remembering that studying in smaller chunks of time is a really effective way to study. We don't need to spend hours and hours and hours the couple nights before. And in fact, many cases, it's not really that effective because we can get brain fatigue and our brain really can only comprehend a certain number of large concepts at a time. So what you might find is as you're trying to cram the night before, you're going through the motions of studying, but really nothing is sinking in and you're really too tired for your brain to be focused and work effectively. The other thing too that can often happen with cramming is that you feel like you put in a lot of time and effort, but when you come to the exam, suddenly you feel like your mind is going blank. Or after you leave that exam, you feel like, now I don't remember anything. Especially in your first year, you're going to be learning a lot of foundational information, and you may find that your second, third, fourth year classes, really build on that information. So it's helpful if the information that you're studying can really be in your brain long term. And the way we really help move information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory is by studying regularly and using recall and those active study techniques. So what I really encourage for you as one step is to think about studying earlier and breaking up your studying into smaller chunks so that you can really be focused and use your brain to the maximum of its ability. Okay. One thing I want to mention too is as we look on this slide here and we can see this chart, it's sort of outlining a little bit or illustrating how our brain and our memory can work and why spaced repetition is such a powerful technique for studying. So if we look at the chart on day one or really zero, on the axis there, when you've learned the information in light blue, everything is, you've just finished the lecture, everything feels fresh in your mind. But if a day later I asked you, what was that lecture about? You'll notice that, you probably remember, 60% of the information. Most of it kind of seems clear, but half of it is sort of fuzzy. If you review your information, kind of like I was mentioning before, reviewing your notes 24 to 48 hours after, that is a little mini recall, mini study session that boosts your memory or your ability to remember that information back up to 100%, or maybe it's going to be 95%, right? We don't remember every little detail, but we remember the majority of it. Now, because you've already done that recall session, if after 2 more days on day 3, I ask you again, what do you remember about that lecture on Monday? This time, while you're not going to still remember 100% or 95%, you're going to forget a smaller amount because you had that recall. So you can see how every time you recall information or restudy information, the memory loss actually reduces. So studying a little bit at a time, keeping that information top of mind, practicing remembering that information and understanding that information all builds up to help us better remember that information when it comes to the exam. The other thing that happens too is as we space out our learning, this space, this learning, forgetting, gives our brain a chance to kind of like let that information marinate a bit in our brain and actually build some connections. So you might start to feel that within these spaces, maybe something you were struggling with before, or you couldn't quite remember or couldn't quite grasp that concept, by giving a little bit of space and time and then reviewing that information again, those connections have a chance to form and it can help you better understand concepts or even sometimes have those aha moments in your learning. And that really comes with space and time. So spacing it out. And then just the reminder, as noted on this slide, Remembering to focus on what you don't know. So every time we are reviewing our notes or retesting ourselves on it, really narrowing down that information so that we're using our time efficiently and effectively on information that we don't know, and we're not just using it in an unconscious way, restudying information we feel good about. That being said, when I talk about spacing information out and focusing on what you don't know, that is in like the study process leading up to your exam. But it is important to remember that just before your exam, maybe it's just a couple days before, you do want to review everything, because while something may have felt really comfortable and familiar at the beginning, over time it can soften up. So we want to make sure that we want to do a general review of everything leading up to the exam. Now, how do we build this more regular review into our schedule, right? Because many of us will have good intentions about wanting to start studying earlier, but the most common thing I hear is, I meant to, but I still ended up cramming. So what if we got intentional with our studying, right? So linking back to our very first presentation on time management and really being intentional with our time about attending our classes and setting aside time for our coursework. That can be for reading, note review, assignments, but also studying. So what if every day you took time to study just a small amount for each of your courses? If you think about this, that small commitment, it really builds up. And then when it comes to, your more focused study time just before the exam, you're already miles ahead because you're not starting from scratch. A lot of this information feels familiar. If you've had questions along the way or something you didn't know, you've had that opportunity to get those questions answered, and now you're just reinforcing that material. So by creating a study schedule for yourself, it really can be a game changer in student success. So that is looking at your notes, within the 24 to 48 hours. It might be doing a weekly note review. It's breaking your studying up into regular but smaller chunks. I made a note in here about, taking breaks after 50 minutes, some flexibility within this. But if you really think about studying and a lot of brain focus, after an hour of doing anything, a hard workout or studying, there's fatigue. So your brain is the same way. So thinking about giving your brain a break. I said some flexibility because if you find if after 50 minutes, wow, like you're really in a good groove, don't stop just because I said so. Wait till you're feeling a little bit of fatigue and then making sure you take a good break so that your brain can be refreshed as you go back to studying something else. On the other hand, you might find you have a smaller attention or focus time. So maybe 30 minutes is the max for you. What I suggest is that as you are studying, when you feel your brain starting to fatigue or wander, or you've been repeating the same information a few times, that's a good indicator that you need a bit of a break. And again, like with everything I've been saying, being intentional with that time as well. So with that break, maybe it's just a 10-minute break, or maybe it's a 20-minute break, but ensuring that you come back to the studying. And during that break, thinking about how can we let our brain actually have that break. So encouraging a break to be something like getting up from that seated desk position, maybe going for a little walk, getting some water or having a snack. I certainly encourage that you don't go on your phone or check emails or watch a show, because those can easily become, instead of just a 10-minute break, they can become a half-hour break or longer. And while it feels relaxing, you're not actually giving your brain a chance to rest. So thinking about giving that brain a rest, moving your body, staying hydrated as a way to take a break before you sit back down to do more studying. And then finally, thinking about, as we're studying, that as our courses and our professors are different, how we approach our studying for these different courses might be different depending on what the requirements are or what the course content is. So it's okay if one class you find flashcards are your number one study technique, and in another class it's more about doing diagrams, or in another class you just really need to talk out the information. right? So each class is different, each person is different. So it's trying out different study techniques and figuring out what works best for you for which type of courses. One more actual tip I'll say too about when it comes to exams is remembering how important it is to just pause after a quiz or pause after your first midterm and using the feedback from that exam or that quiz to help inform you how to study for the next one. And I say this because it's a small step, but one that we don't really think about. You know, we have that exam and we did really well or we did really poorly, and then we move on with our course or thinking about the next exam. But what kind of feedback can we get from that first exam, right? We can think about, how was my studying and did I prepare well enough? Do I find, based on my mark, did I study the right information or did I not? Do I find the professor studies or focuses a lot of questions from the lecture and examples, or are they very specific with the readings and the textbook? That can be great information to help you use your time, again, effectively and efficiently for the remainder of the semester. So just taking a quick pause after each quiz or exam, wherever you're getting marked feedback, and seeing how you can use that feedback to improve your study technique for the remainder of the semester. Okay. All right, so in summary, when it comes to effective study skills, it's focusing on understanding over memorizing, because that will help us in the long run, and that helps us to memorize information, but also understand it and be able to answer more challenging questions where they're looking at critical thinking or application or other types of questions. Use those active learning strategies. So get involved with your learning. Instead of just rereading your notes, try to find ways to test yourself and challenge yourself with the information. Because the harder you work to learn something, the more likely you are to remember it and the longer you are to remember it. Consider creating a study group, not only to help your understanding, but to build a support network, to help create study tools for yourself. You can learn a lot from your fellow students. Also great for accountability, because if you know your study group for a class is going to meet each week, that's a really great way to help ensure that you stay up with that class and on top of everything, and you'll feel much better prepared when it comes to exam time. And finally, yes, studying early and studying often. Give yourself that time to really learn and understand that information, to give your brain a chance to build those connections. Also, get questions answered or get further information on anything that you don't feel 100% about. This will certainly help you feel more confident and more prepared heading into your exams. Okay. I'm going to stop that presentation there.